Good evening, good morning, good day. I know there are people from the four corners of the earth who may be watching this video, so I'm not sure what time it is where you are. I am in session 2. This is History, Legacy of Indenture and Construction of Identities. My name is Baytoram Ramharack. I live in New York. And my presentation today is going to be on Coolitude, its application to Indian indenture in the Caribbean. I think the Caribbean maybe a little, I hope you can see it. All right. This concept, I'm using the theme Coolitude because I'm working currently on a study of Jang Bahadur Singh's wife. The picture on the screen, you can see it. Jang Bahadur was actually a ship doctor who traveled with the Girmitiyas, the immigrants, back and forth. But his wife also played a very crucial role in Guyana, cultural role. So this presentation is part of that package. So today, my purpose here would be twofold. One is I'm going to try to trace the evolution of Coolitude as an acceptable social science paradigm. And secondly, I'm hoping to examine its usefulness or as an intellectual tool for an understanding of the Indian indenture experience, specifically with reference to the Caribbean. Before I go on any further, I'd like to share with you 3 quotations which has to do with the voice of the Indians in the Caribbean. The first one written by a European, John Edward Jenkins, which basically says that the Indians or the coolies have no voice in the Caribbean. This was written in 1871, a number of years after Indians first came to the Caribbean. And then as we jump to the post-World War II era, 1973, Rajkumari Singh, in a sense, talk about the whole idea that coolies have to have a voice. And I think that is the gist of her quotation that you're seeing on your screen. And as we fast forward, here we have a quotation about a voice that is being articulated in a way to define one person's self as being Indian. And this is by Raihan Shaw, who is considered a social, cultural activist, also a political activist in Guyana. So I think when we talk about the voice of the coolies or the voice of the Indians, we're seeing a sort of an evolution of that voice in the Caribbean. So when we talk about the Caribbean, or the Girmitiyas of the Caribbean, let me share with you some background information so you have a sense as to what the region looks like when it comes to Indian indenture. The first British colony was in Guyana. So Indians were first brought to Guyana, British Guyana in 1838, followed by Trinidad and Tobago in 1845, and so on, as you can see from the dates. This obviously is following on the heels of Mauritius in 1834. So when you look at the numbers here, most of the Indians were brought to Guyana, Trinidad. Suriname was a Dutch colony. Of course, Jamaica, Guadeloupe, controlled by the French. So when you look at the population today of the Caribbean, we do have large segments of the Indian population in places like Guyana, Trinidad, Tobago, and Suriname, where Indians actually form the majority of the population there. Suriname has a large segment of Javanese, as well as Creoles and Africans who form part of the population. And of course, very different from, let's say, places like Mauritius. We have almost 70% of the population are descendants of the Girmitiyas. And of course, Fiji has a population that's kind of closely aligned to Guyana. Which I think is much less than 39%. And of course, South Africa has a large population, but represents 2.5% of the entire population. So to summarize what I'm saying here is that Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname do have a large section or segment of the Indian population, the Girmitiyas, so to speak. So to come back to this concept of Coolitude, which I'm applying to an understanding of the work that Alice Singh has done in the Caribbean, that theme goes back to primarily the writing, as most people are aware, of Khalil Tourabuli, who originally from Mauritius but now resides in France. The gist of his argument, and I'll get back, I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. Coolitude, much of the theoretical development of that concept was found in his published book with a colleague, Marina Carter, in 2002, Coolitude. And then this year, there was a second sort of a follow-up. We have authors who have applied that Coolitude theme to their writing. And of course, another major development in this theoretical development is the work of Veronique Bragard from Belgium. So essentially, you know, what this work is trying to do has a lot to do with what you know, Michel Trullo has written about in 1995 in his book Silencing of the Past. Essentially, to go back to the quotation we saw earlier by Jenkins, here in the Caribbean and in other places, the work or the history of Indians, Indian indentured, or silenced. So there is a movement now, which obviously is attributed to Coolitude. It's not necessarily a movement, but it's an intellectual exercise trying to recapture that history. So it's not necessarily just directed to Indian indenture, thus the notion of an inclusive indenture. So that history is being written about. Initially, the focus was on the sort of a poetic approach, poetology expression of coolies, which is found in much of the initial writing. Tourabuli, of course, in 1992, in his later work, explained the whole notion of, you know, the coolie. When he says coolie, I'm also speaking of every navigator without a ship's register. Every man who was going towards the horizon, whatever the ship, and of course the ship, and for when one crosses the ocean plays a crucial part, which I'll come back to in a minute, of what this sort of approach, a Coolitude approach, entails. So when we talk about Coolitude, we are arguing, or at least from the narrative, that the notion of the coolie indenture experience, the crossing of the Kalapani, the dark water, so to speak, plays a tremendous impact in the role of the development of the Girmitiya communities in these diasporic places that they've gone to. And several of the authors have compared, you know, the Kalapani crossing to the Middle Passage relating to African slaves. The literature also sort of humanizes the whole concept of coolie, giving it a sort of a positive affirmation. So what we've seen over the years, at least within the last 30 years or so, is a sort of a burgeoning or development of this theme that has been applied to many different fields, especially in songs, you know, visual arts, you've got literature, and the one that seems to have captured a lot of attention, especially when you look at the book written by people like Gayatri Bahadur, Coolie Woman, is this whole sort of ancestral root search, where people are trying to get back to learning about their history. So those are developments that have been encouraged by this notion of the Coolitude theme. The literature also argues that the Girmitiyas find themselves in what is called a liminal world. Bragard argues that, and this is a quotation from her, those who cross the Kalapani are no longer Indian and have to construct new identities for themselves. So metaphorically, The literature focuses initially on the sea coral, right, found at the bottom of the sea, different parts of the sea. And why the focus on the sea coral? Well, it's something that's transformational, it's diverse, it's fluid, it's amorphous. So the concept of the Girmitiyas engage in what is called changing relationships and being influenced by the environment in which they live holds firm in this whole notion of the Coolitude theme. Some authors, especially Braggart, for instance, have pointed to folks in the Caribbean, and one of those, poetic reflection dealing with the Coolitude theme has to do with the work of Guyanese Mahaday Das, famous poem, which is called "They Came in Ships." The thing about this poem is that it doesn't just deal with the ancestral crossing. It fast forward into the post-World War II era and focuses on the problems that Indians face in the Caribbean, specifically in Guyana. For instance, it addresses the issue of political oppression. It addresses the issue of how Girmitiyas have suffered, and that suffering has continued into the post-colonial era. A very important poem. So what I've done on my own, in my head, I try to construct a sort of a schematic representation of what I think Coolitude represents. Not to get too bogged down into this, but I think the ancestral India obviously play a crucial role, leading to the transoceanic crossing within those diasporic communities we talked about in the Caribbean earlier. You have a number of situational issues that they have to deal with, right? There's discrimination, there's marginalization, of course there's colonial hegemony, which leads to oppression, extracting as much labor as possible from the Girmitiyas. But what happens in those societies is you have identity formation taking place, whether it includes, what some scholars in the Caribbean refers to as creolization, or borrowing and adopting cultural values or cultural traits from others, including assimilation or hybridization, leading to something other than what the Girmitiyas initially came with. So the coral is not the only metaphorical reflection of the Coolitude theme, but of course the sea, the ships, and the stars, and so on, play a role in that. So the essential goal, in a sense, if I could use the word goal, is to create that Trullotian notion of unsilencing the history, right? To regain the lost Coolie history, reclaiming the Coolie history, and documenting the Coolie history, right? Or reimaging the Coolies. I've got some broken lines from ancestral India to Coolitude, and from contemporary India, post or independent India, leading to Coolitude, because again, the literature, in a sense, de-emphasizes those connections, right? Arguing that a new person emerges in terms of identity in these diasporic communities where Indians reside. So to come back to the notion of creolization, this has been a key point, or one of the key points in shaping a distinct Caribbean Indian identity, right? I've talked about that before, but when you look at the history of folks in the Caribbean, you're seeing that there's a sort of a resistance to some of these imposed changes on them, especially going back to colonialism. There's evidence that assimilation is not necessarily something that they have accepted wholeheartedly. Issues of creolization also has been attributed to a culture shared by Africans in these societies, or the Europeans, based on Christianity and so on. So there's been resistance, especially to creolization. So and one has to also recognize the fact that when you look at these Caribbean societies, the cultural traits, cultural values, even though there may have been a transformation from the original values and traits when they left India, some of those things still remain dominant among members of the Indian community, whether it's going back to traditional India and looking at religious values, or whether it's looking at the relevance of the Quran, which accompanied the Muslim population who have come to that region. So in terms of Indian identity, what the literature also argues is that India, in a sense, ceases to be this sort of a ultimate referent. So there's a bridge, so to speak, from the time that the immigrants boarded the ships. Once they've reached the colonies, you see the process. Again, this is the argument made by the Coolitude literature, is that there's a reconstruction of the Indian identity, right, taking place in these multicultural social ecosystems that now has a native population, whether it's the Amerindians or whether it's Africans who came before, the indenture laborers, and so on. The literature also places tremendous influence, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the oceanic crossing, the crossing of the Kalapani, has sort of created a sort of a jihadi brotherhood among the Indian community, thereby eliminating caste hierarchy. I do not believe that well, let me just rephrase this. I believe that the Girmitiya experience in the plantation, which lasted for a longer period of time, and sometimes those ship voyages would last for about 3 months initially, but plantation work required, or contractual work required, that the folks on those plantations be there for 3 years or 5 years. And I think that experience also has contributed greatly to an elimination of the caste hierarchy, which is evident in the Caribbean. The literature also, in a sense, reduces India to a land of myths, and the mythical land of the ancestors, which I'll come back to hopefully at the end. So as a theoretical approach, in terms of critique, I would say the first one that stands out is the whole concept of its derivative from the term coolie, or the coolies, which when you scan the literature, it sort of pejoratively refers to the Indians, thereby the coolie concept, as thieves, robbers, plunderers, inferior, degenerates, and so on. And there's a lot of narrative coming out from the European tradition that, in a sense, makes a lot of assumption about the coolies, right? Secondly, the term actually assigned Indians a prominent temporal state of being, rather than focusing on the evolution of the Indian community in these societies. And essentially, it does not consider a continuous cultural manifestation that we generally observe among members of the Indian community, especially when we consider past and previous influence of ancestral India on these diasporic communities in the Caribbean. To borrow a quotation from Shanaz Mohammed, by reading the coolie identity as merely a judicial entity, meaning that obviously the coolie, or the lives of the coolies or the Indians, were guided by strict guidelines. There was a strict penal code that guided their behavior. By doing so, and by fixating on that notion, Turabulli overlooks the entire biopolitics behind the racially pejorative label affixed to the indentured laborers. My point here is that this is a term that has been humanized. When you compare coolie, let's say, to the N-word in the African American community, there has been a consistent effort not to humanize the concept, but to destroy the concept because of what it symbolizes historically. And the other point I'd like to make here is that it does not take into consideration the colonial power dynamic at play in the emergence and sustained use of the term. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this term was primarily used among the Europeans, not necessarily among the Indians, or the Chinese, members of the Chinese community. So by way of a conclusion, I do believe that Coolitude provides multiple opportunities for unsilencing of the subaltern. When you think of the notion of Slovak's use of the term, here's a community of people whose history has essentially been silenced since the crossing or boarding on the ship. And we're dealing with people who have crossed 2 oceans, not just one. I think the body of literature that has developed over the years add to Caribbean Indian historiography. But essentially, I go back to what I had pointed out before. Coolitude romanticizes ancestral links and overplays the indentured laborers' social and political authority, a point shared by Shanaz Mohammed. And of course, as I said before, the concept does not incorporate the continuing dynamics of cultural recovery and identity transformations. For instance, where do we draw the line in this process of identity building? Does it end with the first generation of Girmitiya? Does it end with the second? Or does it end with the 3rd generation, of which I am a part of that community from Guyana? So in terms of looking forward to the future, I'm suggesting that works dealing with the Coolitude theme should reflect some level of scholarly, scientific, interdisciplinary, and comparative approaches that goes beyond the inventive poetics. Not to suggest that there aren't work of this sort, but I think that's an area that needs to be expanded so that we can have a broader picture of not just the Girmitiya experience in the Caribbean, but in other parts of the world where these communities exist. I point to one source, which I know most people would be familiar with, Gayatri Bahadur's book titled Coolie Woman, The Odyssey of Indenture, where she uses a rigorous imaginative methodological approach that reveals the challenges, the epistemic challenges that we face with creating the archive of the history of the Girmitiyas. In her book, she describes how she was forced to look at the archival materials in Guyana, in Britain, and in India, and where those materials were missing, she had to develop a sort of a Socratic method to ask guiding questions, and even sometimes putting herself in her great-grandmother shoes to try to articulate, what she would have been thinking or to describe her experience. But I want to come back to this whole notion of, the interdisciplinary comparative approach. And I think we do have to move away from the discursive formation and relate that body of discovered material. And by doing so, we need to look at, to borrow, something that Toraboli himself has recognized in his latest publication, a sort of a transdisciplinary, namely a comparative approach across discipline that captures the experience of the Indian community in these, widespread diaspora, especially in the Caribbean, where I think, even though we've seen a burgeoning of these sort of narratives from different folks, that trend needs to be continued. So with that, hopefully we can deal with questions during the answer and question period. Thank you for listening and allowing me to share this information with you. Again, thank you.